Okay, good, good. Can you hear me okay?
Right. So we're talking about the parallel Polis
Yeah.
piece
Well,
in the alternative that Pat Keane asked me to write, and
right.
that came out of your alternatives festival
Uh-huh.
that we had in Dorset in June.
That's true. But it's also pertinent to two major news stories at the moment, one of which is the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Yes.
And I'm keen to sort of ask you about that vis-a-vis love of peace and the what it means vis-a-vis whether Ukraine made the right decision to fight. But also things are heating up in Scotland, um,
Mm.
in the sense that in about a month's time there'll be the Supreme Court ruling, which will almost certainly say that Scotland cannot legislate for its own referendum and require
Yeah.
consent from Westminster, which will lead to the next stage of the next
Mm.
general election being fought exclusively on the question of independence.
I
Uh,
hope so. Yeah.
right. So that's but in that context,
Mm.
there was a letter this week from Stephen Noon, the former sort of head of strategy of the Yes campaign, whom I met actually back in 2014 when I was helping the campaign a little bit. And he's been a Jesuit priest or Jesuit initiate, learning to become a Jesuit for the last
Yeah.
few
Yeah. I
years.
saw that. Yeah. Mm.
And the reason I connected these things is that I felt the spirit of what he was arguing for Scotland was quite similar to the spirit of what you were arguing for Ukraine. And hear me out on this, but in essence, he was counseling a kind of patience, because what he's saying is, as I read it, he's saying, "Look, I still want independence for Scotland." He says,
Mm.
I've lived for it all my life. It's clearly what I want, and if it's possible for us to have the referendum, we should go ahead and we should try and win the referendum. But he says, if we cannot do it that way, he's not so sure the current plan proposed by Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish government, to escalate in effect, and that's his language, to escalate to have the general election fought only on the issue of independence. He thinks that would be too divisive by the sounds of it, that it would actually like really tear apart the fabric of Scottish civil society and further alienate or further create further
Mm.
tension between Scotland and England, arguably as well.
Mm.
But hold that thought for 1 second, because what I thought was interesting about it was he wasn't giving up on the overall goal. Still very much wants Scotland to be independent long term, but he had this sense of what we spoke about back at the Realization Festival, courageous patience. His view was, if you can't do it the right way, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it the difficult way or the way of conflict, the way of grievance. Maybe you should wait it out and see what else you can do in the meantime. Create some kind of, as he calls it, independence within the UK, by which I think he means independence of mind, the more wholehearted break with much of what's happening in Westminster. Anyway, I say that as one story,
Mm.
but the reason I want to ask you about it particularly, if you can hold, there's a lot to hold in mind, but when we spoke at the Realization Festival, you've been very careful and wisely so to say what the Ukrainians should do is a matter for the Ukrainians. And
Mm.
you may have your views, but ultimately it's not your call to make.
Yeah.
You have drawn a comparison with the Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic,
Mm.
and Slovakia, that when the Soviets invaded, um, back, how many years ago was that now? 68 was that? Or 60?
68, 1968, yeah.
Yeah. So when that happened in 68, the leader of the time ordered the army to stay in their barracks, not to fight. And
Mm.
you say that although it was very difficult for a lot of people in Czechoslovakia at the time, after one generation, they had their freedom again, and no part of the country was destroyed. Few lives were lost. You were indicating this, an open question, I think you were saying, is look, maybe that kind of patience, it doesn't mean you accept it. It doesn't mean it's okay or normal. You still resist it spiritually, emotionally, and culturally in many ways, but you don't necessarily fight it with bombs and bullets and tanks and HIMARS and everything else. And that's interesting for me. The tension between these two stories I find fascinating, because in a sense, okay, Ukraine obviously have fought back, and for many that's a great source of admiration and inspiration, and they've just recently gone on the counterattack in Kherson, and for many people this is really exciting. But I think you've noted just how many scores of thousands of people will die on both sides ultimately. How many cities have been absolutely pummeled and destroyed. And you're just asking, are you sure it's worth it for the freedom? Is war necessarily justified? And the parallel I see between these two things is, in both cases, there's an alternative solution to the kind of escalation. Now, Scotland and Ukraine are very different contexts, but they're both looking at a scenario very different, just to be clear. I'm not making any moral equivalence at all. But there's potentially a situation where both are relatively disempowered, not able to exercise their sovereign will in the way they'd want to. Having a choice either to escalate or to somehow find a way of resisting more patiently. So that's how I saw the conundrum, and I wanted to share with you how you saw it.
Okay. You were breaking up a bit there. I was able to get it, what you were saying. Is your internet stable, or is it my end here that's probably the problem?
It should be pretty stable, yeah.
Yours stable, yeah. So it's probably mine, but the footballers are going home now, so hopefully mine will resolve.
Is that because they all use what happens there? They all use local Wi-Fi, or what? How
I think they're all sending video of the match or something, and it just overwhelms the local network capacity.
Right.
So if I break up, just get me to repeat. So you're looking at three situations here. You're looking at Russia and Ukraine. You're looking at Russia and Czechoslovakia back in 1968, and you're looking at Scotland in 2022. And they've all got certain similarities of a large, powerful neighbour. In the case of Scotland, in round figures, tenfold population difference between England and Scotland. And a small unit, many but not all of whom feel that they are being pressured, they are being pushed in a direction they don't want to go by the large neighbour. In the case of Scotland, the principal, but by no means the only presenting issue that has changed since the referendum in 2014 has been us being forced into Brexit out of the European Union. 62% of Scots voted to stay in the EU. The latest polling is 72% want to stay in the EU, but we have been forced out. We have had our European citizenship stripped away from us with all the consequences that involves. So that is the surface justification for having another referendum now. Now, the major difference between us and the other two cases of Ukraine and Czechoslovakia is that they were in situations that did not pretend to be democratic. We are in a situation that purports to be democratic. We are in a situation where Margaret Thatcher indeed had said that if a majority of Scottish MPs were returned in favour of independence, that would be a convincing case for independence to happen. We now have more than just a majority. We've got an overwhelming majority of Scottish MPs at Westminster, but still they tell us, no, You're too wee, you're too poor, you're all the rest of it. You can't go it on your own. And basically, we know what's behind that. That we've got the oil, we've got the energy, the renewable energies. We've got, and this is particularly important, the military space. Not just the visible military space, but also the, all the low-level flying dynamic and things like the submarine and artillery ranges that are all over Scotland. That kind of stuff. And remember that one of the main drivers of the Union in 1707 in the first place was that England wanted to shut the back door because it feared the Spanish or French sneaking in through Scotland. So they wanted to nip in the bud Scotland's good relationships with European neighbours in order to consolidate a British identity, which is why terms like internal and even inner colonization come into the dialogue around this. See, the term internal colonization is used in various ways, normally in an economic sense by Michael Hector, etc. But it's also used in a wider sense of colonization within a political entity. So you could say the former Soviet Union was a colonizing entity of places like Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, Ukraine, and all the rest of it. So the debate hinges around that, but the big difference is that we claim to be in a democracy. Therefore, I felt that, is it Newland? Is that his name?
And Stephen Noon.
Okay, so basically, I haven't read his original thing. Rather, I read Mike Small's riposte on Bella Caledonia the day before, yesterday, and assuming that what Mike gave there is a reasonably balanced representation, which it had the appearance of being, then my sense is that Newland was playing down the significance that this is happening within a democratic framework. This is happening in a framework where it is entirely appropriate that Liz Truss says, if I'm elected Prime Minister, I'm going to do this, that, or the other, because that is what happens in a democracy. And Keir Starmer does his thing. They lay out their table. So personally, my hope is, because I'm in favour of Scottish independence, because I think we do have different cultural values in Scotland as a whole, which is a reason why we have not had a Conservative government, if I understand correctly, since the year I was born, 66 years ago, 1955. Scotland has not voted for the government that has been substantially in power in Britain in recent years, since the year in which I was born. And so it is entirely appropriate to say, if Westminster is going to say, thou shalt not have another referendum, even though we have forced you through Brexit, even though we have subjected you to Boris Johnson, and next it's going to be probably Liz Truss. If it says that, it is entirely appropriate to say, this is our most presenting issue. As a political party, the Scottish National Party, and possibly the Greens with them, I'm not quite sure of their position, but they are also pro-independence, will stand on that single issue. All the other issues can be there in the background, but this will be the single presenting issue. So it is perfectly clear to people that if you vote for the SNP or probably the Greens in the general election, that is what you will be voting for. And so I think it's a masterstroke, because, were the court case to find in favour of the Scottish government and say, yes, you can have a referendum without Westminster giving you permission, then the problem would be that the unionists, as they have said, the unionist parties, I should say, as they have said they are going to do, will boycott it and thereby delegitimize it.
Yeah.
But you can't boycott a general election.
Yeah.
Not without cutting off your own nose. So that is, in my view, that is precisely what democratic politics are for.
Right.
If we stick with the democratic politics of the Conservative Party, it's going to be beg your neighbour. We live in a very poor area and govern here. Already people struggle with heating their houses. They are going to be just frozen. In the Galgale Trust, we are discussing how can we create warm spaces just to protect people in this coming winter. That's what you're going to get if you stick with a Conservative government. In Scotland, thank you, but we want to go our own way. And furthermore, and I speak as somebody who was born in Doncaster, of an English mother, Scottish father. Furthermore, I believe that if Scotland goes its own way, it will help to set a pattern and example by which transformation can come about in England as well.
Yeah. So I know that's your position. I think you've stated it publicly quite often, and it's not that different from my own, for what it's worth. The reason I'm a little, let's say, intrigued to probe further, though, is the argument is that, look, you have a case for finding an adequate response to an intransigent Westminster. If they don't give Scotland the referendum that Scotland asked for, when there is a mandate for the request, which there is, clearly from the last Holyrood election, then they're changing the basis of the union from one of consent, voluntary consent, to one of effectively coercive force of law. Yeah,
which I would call colonization.
Right, I know you would. Yeah. So then the issue, so that to put that case at its strongest from the Westminster side, it would be, I think they don't really have any legal justification for saying this has to be once in a generation. It's not a legal claim. But politically, they could argue, look, things are quite unstable at the moment. The referendum now will further compound existing problems that we have, all kinds of divisions. It will also detract a lot of energy and capacity that we need to actually contend with our problems. Moreover, while it's true that we left the EU without your consent, at least without your direct consent as a nation, we don't feel that's a valid point vis-a-vis Scotland's desire to have another referendum. Because at the point that you chose to be part of the UK, you, in effect, despite what was said in the campaign and everything else, it was tantamount to agreeing to be part of the UK and all of the processes that followed, including Brexit, whether you like it or not. So while you might regret it, you're no different from people in London or major cities like Manchester, where people also regret it. Your nationhood, the argument here is something like your appeal to democracy is not as strong as you think it is, because the polity in question is not the nation necessarily, but the multinational state. That would be their case at the strongest. Now, that's not my view, just to be clear. And the reason they may say it, to add a bit of juice to this, is that there's a piece today by in the Herald, I forget the journalist's name momentarily. Guy from Northern Ireland, I forgot his name, he just blanked me. Anyway, a piece about, in effect, the thin skin of the Yes campaign, as he puts it, the sort of inability to really contend with criticism and to look at its own problems. Now, I find this quite telling and convincing, because it's also my experience of many years of speaking to people in favor of independence, that when you point out all of the problems, and I don't mean like, Project Fear problems, I mean things like, some people will be deeply distressed by this. There are some who will lose their British identity and therefore feel like robbed. And then they'll say, well, you can still have a British identity. It can be a cultural thing like Scandinavia. You don't have to work.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, hang on though. I'm not so sure it's that easy, Alistair, because you want to believe that, but they'll say, no, so do you. That's not what I want. You know, my cultural identity of being British is not just about that. It's also tied up in the political union. And again, patience. This is why I brought the earlier Czechoslovakia and Ukraine comparisons, because, and again, this is me doing devil's advocate here, so I don't want people to be confused. As I've said before, my chess playing background means I try and mobilize the opponent's moves as strongly as I can. There will be people who are distraught to lose their Britishness, not just, you know, yes, in Scotland, but even in the rest of the UK. The very idea of what it means to be British will be changed from a political idea to a cultural idea, but a cultural idea that will be born in arguably in division rather than in unity. So I think the problem sometimes on the yes side is if they were a bit more candid about, yes, it will be traumatic for many. Yes, there will be losses. Yes, there will be risks, but it's worth it. And longer term, it's worth it for England too. And I'd go with it, but that's not the way it comes across. The way it comes across is everything will be fine. There's no problem. It's going to be great, right? Which is, I think, not the whole truth. And therefore, when people try and argue, look, it's not the right time, I don't think it's ridiculous. I mean, I don't think they're right. I think it's Scotland's call to make, but I don't think it's so clear that the answer is to escalate by making the general election a single issue matter. Because once you do that, you've torn the country politically into a direct binary, for or against, with all of the other issues overshadowed, even though those other issues are, for many people, more salient, more important.
I think within a democratic framework that needs to happen, Jonathan.
So but here's the thing, Alistair, which democratic framework? Because Scotland is a kind of polity, right? But so is the UK. And they're both separate and conjoined. And so the democratic framework includes those people affected by Scotland leaving, which includes the rest of the UK. They have a case too. I mean, I'm not saying they should be allowed onto the franchise for the referendum, but it's not as if they're unaffected by this.
Yeah. I mean, you've raised a lot of issues in what you've just said. If I can just try and gather myself around them. I think the underlying question you're raising is to what extent do English people, and it is primarily English people as distinct from Welsh or Northern Ireland, call it our UK, rest of the UK, if you want, to what extent do they have a right to determine Scotland's future?
Well, again, I would say that's a bit tendentious in the sense that Scotland's future is also the UK. Again, this is me being devil's advocate. Scotland's future is also the UK's future. So if you're thinking...
Well, yes, but you see, if we are talking about a situation that questions the identity of the UK, that it questions the legitimacy of the UK. You know, here is a UK that has lied to Scotland.
Right.
It lied over Brexit.
Right.
It lied over the 2014 referendum.
Right.
It said, for example, that there would be a hard border between Scotland and England, when at that time the UK was within the EU, so there would have been no hard border, except in as much as the EU would probably have said to Scotland, well, there needs to be a transition process going on here, but because you're already in, that's going to be different from other things. So, you know, we're lied about that. We're lied about the vow for constitutional reform. The vow, that was the word they used.
I know, I remember the vow, the Daily Record front page. I was there.
We were lied to. We were told that if we voted for independence, we would be slung out of the EU. Instead, we've been slung out of the EU because of the UK.
I get it. Alistair, like, you don't, the political case for independence does not need to be made.
Basically, the feeling of somebody like me is I'm through with the UK. Right. I do not consider myself to be British.
Right.
I recognise that some people feel that Britishness is a precious identity, to which my response would be, okay, well, it needs to be a bit like when Norway and Sweden split. They've still got a shared Scandinavian identity.
Right.
So I would have no problem with an independent Scotland being able to issue passports that still have British identity as an overarching dynamic on them for those who wanted that. After all, Jonathan, if you are in Northern Ireland, if you are a Northern Irish person, you can more or less choose whether you want to consider yourself to be British and or Irish.
Right.
You know, my.
So, Alistair, if I may, like, I campaigned for yes, as you know, back in 2014.
Yeah. I realize you're being devil's advocate.
I'm trying to
keep on being the devil and press me on the matter.
I'm wearing devil's red for the purpose. No, the reason it's important is that you really made a very strong impression on me when we were speaking about Ukraine. Now, I know this is a shift of register vis-a-vis Scotland, but it will come back to the main point, which was, you know, as someone who felt impassioned on Ukraine's behalf, as someone who's been there, who has Ukrainian friends and so forth, I'm inspired by the resistance. I admire the way they're fighting. I'm really glad they didn't just acquiesce and capitulate. And to be fair, you were not saying that they necessarily should. You merely posed the question: are they sure it's worth it? Exactly. Might it not have been better to find other ways of resisting?
Is there another way? Yes, right. And you see the difference.
Right. Well, that's just I'm coming. So I'm glad we're on the same page. That's what I mean. Is you made a big impression there. You just sowed that seed in my mind. Might it have been? You know, yes, it seems terrible that they would install a puppet in Kyiv, and Russia would be, you know, trying to take over their country and get rid of the Ukrainian language. And it would have been absolutely awful. On the other hand, cities wouldn't have been flattened, thousands wouldn't have died. Maybe it's worth thinking about. In the same way, what I'm trying to convey is there any parallel in the Stephen Noon case, in effect, as I read him, saying, look, if you don't get your way and you're not allowed by Westminster to have your referendum, rather than rushing into the next escalation, which is the democratic move, as you put it, to vote at the election as if it were a referendum. Now, I can see that from one side, that looks like a forced move, almost like you've given us no other choice. Our hands are tied. We didn't want to do this, but what else can we do? We're doing it. But then don't assume that that won't cause all sorts of unintended consequences and grief, because you've suddenly created this very fraught context in which people are trying to defeat a broken conservative government, dysfunctional, you know, whatever, a kleptocratic conservative government in England, and they feel that they need focus to be on that. But meanwhile, a big chunk, one of the constituent nations of the country, is doing a completely different campaign that's about a single issue only. I can see that if your heart is set on Scottish independence, that seems like just a necessary evil. But I think it's important to recognize that it's not costless, you know, that it does create.
But nobody's denying that. Yeah. I mean, we are doing this because of the cost already being imposed in Scotland ever since Thatcherism.
Right.
Ever since Thatcherism destroyed our industry.
Right.
We're doing this. This is a long-term thing.
Yeah.
That has been building up, Jonathan.
Yeah.
And the trouble with Stephen Newland stuff is that it seems very recent and so on. Yeah. But what bothered me is that it's so kind of mollifying.
I know.
That you know, I'm thinking of the kind of people who are in Scotland who are saying, wait a minute, if we are being told by Westminster that we cannot have another referendum, they will not allow us to have another referendum, then we're going to need to start thinking of IRA-type solutions.
Right.
And my concern, Jonathan, is that there are, there are people in any country who, if they feel that their democratic wishes are being thwarted, will turn to violence.
Right.
And I find myself now and again on social media privately taking issue with people. I had somebody just the other day who was arguing violence, basically, and I took issue with him by direct mail and I direct DM. I took issue with him. I also reported him to Twitter as violating terms, and I got a bounce thing back the other day saying that they had taken action on it. He's still online, so presumably he's deleted some of his tweets or something like that. But there is that dynamic potentially there in Scotland. And I think we have to be very careful of saying that if a people are made to feel that they cannot express their democratic wishes, and if their democratic wishes will not be followed, then that undermines democracy itself. Now, I hear what you are saying from the point of view of the chaos that what English voters have done with Conservative governments has put us into. But that is of their choosing. That is something that, Scotland can't sort. Scotland, with 1/10 of the population, cannot sort out England's political and identity problems for it.
No.
And at the deepest level here, of course, are the identity issues. At the deepest level here, in my view, is England as a colonizing power historically. Look at Boris Johnson boasting about the fact that we had colonized at some stage most countries in the world. He boasted about that in the Daily Telegraph. If you Google Daily Telegraph, Boris Johnson colonized, you'll see it coming up.
But most of the
we are dealing with a neighbour in Scotland.
Right.
We're dealing with a neighbour who has never come to terms with what they did historically. What they did being something that we in Scotland became complicit with after the Union. But we are way ahead in terms of decolonisation dynamics just now.
In what sense? I mean, I understand.
Well, in terms of accepting the role we played in slavery,
right?
In terms of accepting the role we played as sub-lieutenants of empire, in terms of accepting the necessity of Scotland being a multicultural country, one Scotland, many cultures.
Sure.
In terms of that sort of dynamic.
It certainly appears that way, and as a Scot, I would also like to believe it, but I suppose I'm trying to probe for the shadow, if you like, of
the shadow of Scotland. Yeah,
shadow of Scotland.
So,
I feel is actually
a
bigger deal than most people realize.
Yeah. Well, let's look at the shadow side of Scotland. The shadow side of Scotland has been, in the past, at any rate, a denial of its complicity in colonialism. It has been. It's been a screwed up religious dynamic, which came about with the Union. The 1688 so-called Glorious Revolution was actually a religious coup. William of Orange bringing in Protestant governance of this fundamentalist Calvinist, Dutch Calvinist type. But, often, and in some cases we still are, in denial of our complicity in that, because we very much embraced it. We embraced it for understandable reasons at the time of countering royalty and bringing in democracy. But we failed to see the way we're also embracing a draconian religious system that has turned many people away from spirituality who didn't need to be. Now, I'll give you an interesting perspective on shadow. Right now, I'm reading, where is it? Did I not have it here? Right beside, yes, here it's right in front of me.
Okay.
100 years in the Highlands.
Right.
um, by Osgood Mackenzie, published in 1922. And just last night, I finished his chapter on religions. And I mean, you know, I'm a Quaker.
Right.
And here is Osgood Mackenzie, this aristocrat, who was born in France,
right,
at one of these kind of Anglo-Scottish families with massive land holdings,
right,
and incredible wealth. I mean, he spent his whole youth going around shooting things. And I was astonished to read, now my mother did not happen to like old Applecross. And besides, she was of a Quaker family herself. And like most of the people, a strong Whig. So as I understand it, the Whigs were the parliamentarians.
Right.
Versus the Conservatives, who were then the Royalists. So she set her heart and soul to help the opposing Liberal candidate, Sir James Madison, who had just before this come back as a very rich man from China, or as Disraeli put it in Sybil, richer than Croesus, however pronounce the god of wealth, with a million of opium money in each pocket. And he had bought the Isle of Lewis from the Seaforth Mackenzies. My mother got, I believe, every voter on the Gairloch estate to vote for Sir James, and Sir James's majority in the county, that is Ross and Cromarty, which encompassed the Isle of Lewis, then exactly equaled the number of Gairloch voters, and so he got in. Now, how is that for shadow side of Quakerism and shadow side of what was going on within Scotland and our own area? Of Scotland, voting somebody like, you know, this filthy, corrupt, warmongering opium war baron in. So, you know, what I would put to you, Jonathan, is that the dynamic in Scotland is now that when we find something like that, something of shadow in our history, we actually positively relish in it. Because we are at a point, and many of us are, I believe many of us are at a point. And in a sense, this is what you are raising just now from your own Scottishness and background. We are at a point to say, let us draw out our own shadow and make it visible, because only then can we better understand where we've come from, where we've got to, and we can also better understand those who perhaps are not so far ahead in examining their political shadows.
Right. So I hear you in terms of the aspiration. I wonder if it's really a reality at this stage. I can see that, you know, you may embody that and speak to it. I'm less sure there's evidence of the nation as a whole reckoning with its own shadow in that way. And by that, I also mean this fundamental division on the Constitution, which I think is, you know, each side struggles to see the other side, to really see what they're feeling and fearing. And there are very few people in Scotland now who actually, you know, love Westminster politics or who believe in the virtues of the Conservative Party. There are very few like that. But there are quite a lot of people. So when you say, for example, that you don't see yourself as British and let Britain go and so forth, I feel less inclined to do that. I think Westminster politics is utterly broken. And I think the last few decades of Conservative rule have, you know, significantly damaged the fabric of the UK, including weakening relations with Scotland. And I know that growing up, Scottish independence was not a serious idea, and it's gradually become much more serious. But nonetheless, culturally, there's a great deal that combines, you know, different aspects of the UK, and many of us are mixed in some sense, either through marriage or parenting, or through living in one part of the UK while being from another part of it. And you might say, this is what I mean by shadow. You might say, where Scotland's become independent, here's the positive story, right? And I hear it a lot. Scotland becomes independent and it becomes a great beacon of progressive, ecological, social democratic, quasi-Nordic, educationally inspired, renewable energy, global icon. perfect model nation, right? And meanwhile, England does its colonial reckoning, finds a way to actually properly devolve its power away from Westminster, grows up as a country, perhaps rejoins the EU. Goodness knows quite what happens to Wales, but they'll find their own way one way or the other. There might be United Ireland. And then we have this archipelago, the North Atlantic or East Atlantic archipelago, happily with itself finally. Right? That's the positive vision, right? But it's by no means the only one, nor is it the most likely one. There are other scenarios. This is what I mean by encountering shadow, that, there are other scenarios where there's deep simmering resentment from about at least a third of the population in Scotland who feel that they've been deracinated effectively. And then you have a big chunk of people in the rest of the UK who feel their own country has been significantly weakened and diminished in the eyes of the world. So they themselves have lost stature as a result. And this is not a minor thing in a context where authoritarianism is on the rise and social media makes, dog whistle politics more powerful. So the other scenario is one where by Scottish nationalism precipitates authoritarianism in the rest of the UK, which possibly leads to conflict or to attempt to bring back Scotland into the fold. There are all sorts of other scenarios which are much less sanguine. And meanwhile, of course, the seas are rising and the coastal communities are going under. So, I'm just trying to say that. When I read Stephen Noon's piece, the reason it gave me pause is I did find it far too sanguine about the UK that he's talking about. The UK that he was dealing with in 2014 is gone. We have something altogether more English nationalist and destructive and frankly stupid. So in that sense, I don't think it's right what he's saying. But his principle of don't be so quick to be constitutionally right that you're politically destructive. And I find there was something resonant in that.
Yes, I think you have to be careful there, Jonathan, that you're not expecting Scotland to put right England's problems. I mean, the most cogent reason I hear from unionist friends for staying in the Union is that if there were the fairly, on the edge of being hung Parliament, the Scottish left-wing vote would swing it for the UK and push the UK into a socialism it would not otherwise have on the English vote. But the counterpoint to that is, what right have we got in Scotland to feel that we ought to use our minority vote, 1/10 in round figures of the population, to tell the English what to do? I don't want to tell the English what to do. I simply want to say that for those of us in this community, a nation of the community writ large, given that we consistently want to vote for more socially progressive, as I would see them as being, policies, as distinct from capitalist individualistic policies of the Conservative Party, let us get on and do that. And furthermore, I think that certainly in the short term they will probably make us poorer. And I kind of feel, I would rather, it's like these newly independent African countries and so on, that whose leaders said we would rather be poorer but independent, self-reliant, than be dominated from Westminster.
No, I hear you on that, and it's, again, the arguments for independence are strong. But what I'm not so sure about is in terms of where the political legitimacy lies. You see, there are four nations. I think there's no arguing that there are four nations.
Well, hang on, wait. You just said four nations. What do you mean four nations? I mean, Northern Ireland. Since when did that become a nation?
Well, okay.
Wales was traditionally a principality. So let's be a little bit careful about this false equivalent in a situation where Scotland has always had its own legal and its own educational legal structure.
Fine. Point taken. I was about to say, but for the sake of argument, there's effectively two. But what I'm trying to get at is that for those people in the UK writ large, the nation, the sort of constituent nation within the multinational political entity is not the trump card necessarily. It's not the way you frame that discussion there about why would Scotland change what England voted for is, well, because Scotland and England are part of a political union, and therefore a vote in Scotland is equivalent to a vote in England in some idealized abstract sense. And I mean, the alternative way of looking at it is, look, what if you had proportional representation and constitutional reform such that you didn't have these conservative governments on 30-odd% of the vote, complete absolute power, then you still have your different parts of the UK, more chance of a progressive government. But even then, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves, because when we think of PR, we often forget about UKIP votes, and there is quite a strong right-leaning element, particularly in England, but arguably to some extent across the piece. And Scotland also may rediscover its right wing. It's there latently, I think. So
yeah, it's the thing is, I mean, this is very interesting because it does not have poetic legitimacy in Scotland.
Right.
You see, when I think, what are the deepest differences? In Scotland, there is a poetic legitimacy to a communitarian approach. Right. That every year, for example, at the end of January, we celebrate all over Scotland, and we celebrate right across social classes, in as much as social class exists in Scotland. It does exist, but it's not legitimized in Scotland. Very important point. It is not legitimized in Scotland. It is not something to be proud of, to be of an upper social class in Scotland in the way that it can be.
I hear you. Look, don't get me wrong, but again,
in England,
I'm thinking of your middle class family in Bearsden or something, or your people who are going to, I don't know, Gordonson School or Fettes School or whatever. There are these enclaves.
But they don't go shouting off about it, at least not in public. Maybe in their own circles, yes.
Right.
But it's not something you wear on your sleeve in Scotland. On the contrary, in Scotland, it's something that you try to hide.
But okay, then again, I want to speak for the people of Yorkshire and Newcastle and Doncaster and where you hail from, and they don't see themselves in the story you're presenting of England as a class-ridden place. They also feel alienated from it.
Yeah, well, I mean that's where England's got to sort out England's own stuff, and if we can help them from a Scottish perspective, I love it. I love it, Jonathan, when I get invited to speak about these issues in England.
I know, and I also think that England's trapped inside this crypto-colonial edifice of a state. I get it, but I also feel that when I speak to friends who are from particularly the north of England, but not necessarily, even London, you get a lot of it. They're as sick of the UK state as we are. But then when you say, but then England has to sort it out, I just say, well, yeah, maybe that's true, but it's not really an English issue as such. And the idea that English values are prevailing is not true. What you have is a certain political class set of values, a certain electoral system, which is channeling them into this repeated pattern of failed governance. But it's not saying that, so to say that England has to sort their own problems out, they were like, well, that's not really how they see it. They see there's a problem with the UK constitutional state and political culture. It's not obvious that it needs a solution in England separate from a solution in Scotland and so forth.
Yeah, but I mean, you've got to deal with the overwhelming fact that they vote Conservative.
Well, and
I mean, the ones you are referring to are the ones who don't vote Conservative, but nevertheless, England fairly consistently, with the exception of the Tony Blair years, has voted overwhelmingly Conservative in the recent decades.
Not overwhelmingly. Because it first passed the post, you're still speaking about less than half the country in most cases.
In terms of the actual number of MPs through their first part of the post wisdom.
Right.
And remember, both Labour and the Conservatives support that first pass,
which is tragic, and I think
it's tragic, but they've got to sort it out, Jonathan.
Right, but maybe to give the argument its strongest sheen, then would be to say, look, you're right. Maybe there were constitutional solutions to the problems of the UK. Maybe it is the case that by giving Scotland some greater degree of autonomy, by giving England local parliaments, which apparently they don't want, but you know,
well, exactly,
right, and then
you said it.
Yeah, and then creating a voting system which is a better reflection of what people actually want, and maybe putting that second chamber in, I don't know, York or whatever. And then I think the texture of the country does change, and then but then that's not what we have, right? You say,
well, the texture of England changes because in Scotland we've already got proportional representation.
Yeah, but not for UK general elections, you don't.
Well, no, we can't because that's not controlled by us. But
and so
the bits we control, we've got PR.
The other side of this is that the SNP dominance is not quite as dominant as it looks at the general election, because of course the first past the post system massively favors the SNP in Scotland, just as it somewhat favors Conservatives here.
Yeah, I mean, so notice the dynamic there, that you've got the SNP who are opposing the first past the post system, even though it massively favors them.
Yeah.
Because they recognise what makes for good polity.
Yeah, I agree.
And see, let me bring this round now to Parallel Polis.
Okay, good.
And Czechoslovakia, by just rolling back a little bit to where I was talking about the cultural context, the poetic context, Robert Burns, Burns Night, and all the other poetic dynamic that we have. Because it's not just in law and education that Scotland, ever since before the Union and throughout the Union, has had its own system. It's also been in church. In the spiritual life, the Church of Scotland is by law established, not the same as the quote by law established, not the same as being the established church in the English sense of the Queen being the head of the church, as well as of the armed forces and of the state. But rather, the Church of Scotland is recognised as being by law established from the 1921 Church of Scotland Act and all its associated subsequent articles. And part of what that is reflecting is a spiritual, and I would say poetic culture, in which we have a very strong sense of who we are because of a sequence. I mean, Robert Burns is the most obvious one, but there's a whole, series of others, because Scotland is a poetic culture, like Ireland. A culture that holds together the values that we understand ourselves as representing. Now, the trouble for England that I find comes up when I speak about this in England is that they do not have that same sense.
I don't know. I mean, Coleridge. I mean, I don't know, Larkin. Like, I mean, there's no lack of English poets, right?
That's you see, you've got to think in social class terms here. Somebody like Robert Burns Burns Night cuts across social class in Scotland, cuts right across. Whereas in England, because of the Norman conquest and the legacy of the social class system that has sent in place, they are so deeply colonized within themselves that these things are stratified. Culture is very much more stratified in England than in Scotland. And I think that's a very deep problem. I see the hope for it shifting in the kind of countercultural music revolution that came about in the 60s into the mid-70s. That there you saw a kind of unified cultural transition coming about out of the richness of English culture, out of the melting pot of English culture. But I mean, that lasted for about 10 years. And in my view, it is work that has been not completed. It has been work that largely through the forces of Thatcherism, from the political breakup of the mid-70s onwards, has been trampled on. So, one of the reasons, Jonathan, why I'm so plain speaking about Scottish-English differences is that I think there is huge potential in England for it to find itself. But there is also huge work to do, such as we in Scotland have done since the middle of the 20th century. And it's taken us a lot of time to build ourselves up to where we are now.
Right.
But England has to start from somewhere.
Well,
and so, as my friend Luke Concannon of the English group Nislopi puts it, rise up, England. England, rise up. Now is your time to refine who you are in that full Blakean sense of did those feet on England's green and pleasant land, to which I reply in one of my poems, of course they did. Of course those feet walked on England's green and pleasant land. And rather than allowing the Conservative Party to appropriate Blake's immense vision that is embodied in his hymn Jerusalem, that is something which needs to be reclaimed by the population as a whole.
Right.
Woo.
Yeah, well said. Cheers. I'm glad to be reminded of Blake, because as you know, our friend Mark Vernon is a good Blake scholar, and he'd be glad he's in the room, because of course one of many English poets, but England has, I agree, a sort of soul that's somewhat latent and asleep, that is kept restricted under the Union Jack and colonial past and Westminster politics and the class system and so forth,
and the elitism and the whole.
But don't you worry?
The way the poor are being screwed.
Right.
So I sit here, Jonathan, looking through that window onto the street.
I know
it's dark just now, but I sit here and I literally watch poverty shuffling past.
I know you said that.
It's heartbreaking.
I know. And you said literally shuffling. We spoke about this last time. I know, and the country is really, it's really grim. This winter could be particularly bad. They're speaking about a possibility of a general strike. Very much a sense of a country imploding. And I mean that the whole of the UK, but particularly in England in some ways. And, but I suppose I'm just curious that you don't ever doubt when you're making these distinctions, because I can see that there's a kind of Scottish ideal of the democratic intellect, for example, and the sort of Nordic-ish vision of a social democratic country where it's, like you say, poetic license for the communitarian, which is a nice way of putting it. And that vision of Scotland is inspiring and a big source of motivation for the Yes movement. Or, by the way, I think realpolitik would mean if there was a referendum, they wouldn't allow yes to be the answer, because it's sort of too big a head start, but that's not a story. But I also wonder, and you're right, England, in some ways is a bit lost inside this UK edifice. But don't you have doubts sometimes? I mean, when I meet English people, it doesn't take long to feel the cultural differences are quite superficial. I know, of course, there are many, 5 odd million or whatever, but maybe more now. But yeah, and they vary by age and class and generation, but I wonder, a man's a man for that includes English people, right? It's not as though a man's a man for that and only in Scotland.
No, but it depends who you talk to. I have such strong sympathy with many English friends who wrestle with the state of England, and yet a considerable majority of English people in recent general elections vote for a party that quite openly screws the poor.
Right.
And we do not do that in Scotland.
Sure.
We do not do that in Scotland. And I have English relatives, and my wife and I, we're just shocked by their attitudes sometimes. We also have English relatives who think exactly like we do. But the bottom line is that the consistent balance of political power in recent decades has been towards a dog-eat-dog type society. I mean, look at the kind of stuff that Liz Truss is coming out with just now in terms of energy. In terms of energy, I was looking at figures the other day. They're all quoting these prices that energy is going to go up by, and that is based on UK average use. But I was looking, I did my own calculations, and Scottish energy use is 10 to 20% higher than English energy use.
Right.
And in places like rural parts of the Highlands and Islands, it's even much higher than that.
Yeah.
This is going to kill people, Jonathan.
Yeah, I know.
This is why people are getting angry in Scotland. This is why, if we do not insist upon democratic process,
right,
and saying it is perfectly acceptable to vote on a single issue, do you want to be independent or not, and then expect that to be requested, and if not, to go into decolonizing mode.
Okay, that's what I want to ask.
It is perfectly acceptable.
Right.
If we don't do that, then we very much risk setting up forces that are not democratic and would be hard to control in the same way that Northern Ireland was hard to control.
Okay. No, I hear you on that. And I wanted to ask you, though, so let's play this out. So let's imagine that the Supreme Court says, no, you do need Westminster consent. Westminster says, no, you're not getting it. Scotland says, okay, when the general election comes, we've already said it's going to be a single issue. The general election comes and goes. Now, I don't know quite what happens in the UK as a whole, but let's imagine Scotland does vote for independent supporting parties, including Greens and SNP and any other minority parties, but especially those two. And let's say they get, it'd have to be votes and not seats in this context, right? I think. So let's say they get 50% plus one or whatever. And then they say, and what's next? The UK shrugs and says, well, you're sending your SNP MPs down to Westminster as usual. We're still not giving you a referendum. Nothing has changed legally. What's the next move? You say go into decolonization mode. What does that mean?
Decolonization.
Yeah. What does that look like?
Because at the moment, we are not, at the moment, in my view, we do not have legitimacy to say we're in a colonized status quo.
No, I understand.
However, if in an election as decisive as that, a single issue election, at least single issue as regards how the pro-independence parties would pitch it, we went for a majority for independence. Then if that is refused, yes, we are into decolonization mode, the same as other colonies of the British Empire have been in.
What does that look like in practice? What does that?
Well, that is why I emphasize parallel polis.
Right.
That is why I wrote that piece in Bella Caledonia about what Czechoslovakia did in 1968 when they rejected the use of armed violence. And although it took them 21 years to reach the point of their independence, they did so relatively bloodlessly by establishing what Václav Bender and Václav Havel called a parallel polis, namely a parallel way of understanding their identity, their culture, even their economy as much as they could. Now, this is where Václav Havel's essay, which is online and it's not paywalled, The Power of the Powerless, which I discuss in that Bella Caledonia piece, is so important because he talks about the strange interdependency between the colonized and the colonizer. He says you cannot stand totally apart. You don't have that power to do that. At the end of the day, it was Russia that was controlling their education, controlling their economy, controlling this, that, and the other. But you could subtly subvert it. He gives the example of the greengrocer. The greengrocer, whose vegetables and fruits would arrive, and inside the box would be a little sticker thing or poster thing saying, "Workers of the world unite." And this was part of the Soviet Union's expectation that this would be displayed in amongst the fruit in order to signify compliance. And the revolutionary act of the greengrocer one day was to decide not to display that sign, not to play ball. If we are in a decolonization situation with the UK, because our democratically expressed wishes have been resolutely rejected, resolutely expressed and resolutely rejected, then we move into a mode with saying we are not going to play ball with this idea of Britishness that is being forced onto us against our majority will. And then you're into the creative, on the assumption that that is not going to be done violently. I mean, I for one, strongly oppose, even to the point of betraying those who would say that they would use violence. I'm not going to cover up for violence. I would strongly oppose any kind of violent initiative. I've been very clear online with that people in the way that I've said to you, but I would strongly support measures that would say to the international community, look, we are a nation, we are an ancient nation. That's why it is called a union of England and Scotland, and with the other bits in slightly different status. That is why it is called a union. We are saying that union is no longer our democratically expressed choice, and please help us on that path to expressing our self-determination and self-reliance.
Right. I mean, and you won't be alone. There'll be about at least half the country will probably be with you on that. I'm just curious to understand if we get to that point, and that's quite a few steps ahead, but it's quite likely actually. A Scottish parallel polis is quite different from a Czechoslovakian parallel polis because it's not Soviet occupation, it's devolved parliament, and so it must look very different. It must, take a very different color, right?
Yeah. Well, I think we already see a lot of it in Scotland. The vast majority of the cultural community, apart from the kind of classical cultural community, the opera and the ballet, that kind of stuff, the vast majority of the cultural community in Scotland is pro-independence. That was very clear in the last referendum. It's still the case. And you see, this shapes so much of the undercurrent. It's what comes through in the songs, what comes through in the poetry, what comes through in the stories that shape so much. This is why an overwhelming majority of young people in Scotland are pro-independence. It's only the oldies, it's my generation and above that generally are pro-union. The young are overwhelmingly pro-independent. So there's already a parallel polis very strongly going on in the art scene. It's more difficult in the economic scene because those things are much more tightly tied together. Land reform, we see a big difference. I mean, in Scotland, we've got freedom of right to roam. Communities can trump their landowner with rights of preemptive purchase and so on. We've got nearly 3% of Scotland's land back into community land ownership, with over 400 land trusts, not one of which has gone bankrupt, interestingly, to the best of my knowledge. We've got all of that kind of dynamic running in Scotland. The power of a landowner in Scotland is very different than in England. I'm shocked when I go to England and people say, "Oh, we can't walk there because of such and such." I'm just outraged by it. They're so trapped in. I mean, where can they walk? They can go to stately homes and walk along certain rights of way. And, there's a few other places where they can roam, but not all that many. They're very constrained, whereas we can just go anywhere, except in the curtilage, except within people's gardens and certain restricted areas like Balmoral Castle. military defense areas and so on. We have got a freedom, and visitors, have a freedom too. I don't know how they can,
But what I'm not, I mean, all of that is well taken, and I know there are different countries. There's no doubt about that. I don't think even, intelligent, thoughtful people in England wouldn't doubt it either. Even the political class on cross-examination would accept these are different cultures, different political cultures. There's some variation in existing law. They have different legal systems. There's clearly a border. And the way they express their democratic choice has varied for many years. So the case for them being different countries is not in doubt. Nonetheless, the legal situation is you're part of a political union, and one which has been designed in such a way that you cannot leave unilaterally.
Who said? Hang on, who said? Who said?
Well, in the sense
they're telling us we cannot.
Well,
but that's what they told every colony.
Yeah, okay.
That's what they told every colony.
I'm not.
And we are saying, wait a minute. In Scotland, the fundamental issue, as in the draft Scottish constitution, is in Scotland, the people are sovereign.
Right. That
is very different from Bagehot saying in England, the Queen in Parliament is sovereign.
Right. I know. And this is why the court case is not a slam dunk and why it's a little bit interesting. And yeah, all of that. But when I say cannot leave unilaterally, I mean, I'm just merely referring
to Dicey, not Bagehot, I think it was.
Dicey. Okay. But this is when I say can't leave unilaterally, what I mean is at present, without permission of Westminster to hold a legally recognized by the international community and by the Westminster Parliament and by the EU. At the moment, Scotland can't do that by itself. Now, what I'm just probing is if it follows through all those moves, the court case, the election, still the stasis, you say, okay, you kick into a different gear. It's a post-colonial gear. And you're saying that culturally and through the generations, everything is moving towards independence anyway. But I still don't know what it means in terms of, it doesn't, it feels more like another holding pattern. It doesn't look like it's not obviously a strategy as such. It's more of an atmosphere.
Well, I think you raise a very important issue there, because the sense I have is that things are moving towards more localization. That mega states, and in Britain, relatively speaking, in the mega state was getting on 70 million people, whatever it's at just now. That these don't work except on a more federalist basis, and that is why I am an admirer of the EU. Much so I would prefer that it had kept the original name European Community. Because, and I think that needs, as Jacques Delors recognized, Jacques Delors, who was president of the European Commission in the 1980s, 1990s, thereabout, as he recognized, that sense of community cohesion is what it's about. Jacques Delors made a fascinating speech around about 1992, I think it was. I often quote it in my writing, to the European churches, where he said, unless Europe rediscovers its sense of spirituality, its connection with the arts, with the poets and the writers and so on, unless it rediscovers that cultural sense of what it is, the whole project will be doomed. And very, very important thing that he said there. And I think that what we see in the European Union is a relatively loose federation. The lie that Boris Johnson spread to us from long before he was Prime Minister was that we were dominated by that in ways that we were not. We always had control over our own borders and so on. We chose not to exercise that control because we wanted cheap Labour. And then we blamed it on Europe when people didn't like the influx of people from elsewhere that it brought about. But actually, we could always have enforced control over our own borders if we wanted. What I see going on now is that there is a general turn towards smaller political units. The ideal situation would be for Britain still to be within the EU, and then Scotland would become independent, and it would still be,
Right.
it would be no different from
it
would be no different from crossing from France to Belgium. You
I
don't
know.
know you cross, or to Spain. You don't know you've done it.
I know. I get
That's
it.
the situation.
But sadly, it's not where we are, right?
Yeah. So if England chooses to stay out with the EU, that is for up to it. Where that would leave us in Scotland would be the same position as Northern Ireland and indeed the wider Irish Republic. And so basically what that would do is it would push our relationships more into a Celtic world dynamic connecting into Europe. And necessarily, because the English chose it to be that way, having to bypass the English dynamic. That would be costly. It's part of the reason why I say that independence would probably make us poorer in the short term. But, from what I see with the land reform that I've been involved in, Jonathan, and I was one of the pioneers of modern Scottish land reform, was having co-founded the Isle of Egg Trust in 1992. From what I see in that, when people get a sense of self-determination, when they got a sense that they have to exercise their own responsibility and be accountable for it, it draws forth amazing things from people. We see that's what we see in Czechia and Slovakia and other reformed republics like that within the EU, and I believe that is what we would see in Scotland, like we do in Ireland.
I'm totally with you on the positive case for Scotland to go this way. I'm just curious about what I see as quite a likely scenario coming our way. I don't know the years, but I mean, basically, the Supreme Court ruling happens in October. It's quite likely that it will go against Scotland in a sense, or depending on your view for it. But it won't allow for the referendum to be to happen without Westminster's consent. Then the general election. What are we looking at? 24 is that scheduled for? I think.
I forget when it is.
Yeah, but I think it
must be something like that.
And then we don't know how that's going to go, but potentially either it doesn't work and less than 50% of people vote for those parties, or it does work, which I think is probably slightly more likely, but it's hard to say.
Yeah.
And then you're in this position where, okay, people are like, well, you've done that, but they'll say it's a gimmick, or they'll say it's not really a real thing, and you'll say, well, okay, we've done all we can. Now we're going into this decolonization mode. Now, when you say that, you say it with authority and reason and history on your side. I'm not saying you're wrong. I just can't visualize what it means.
Okay, well, let's just think that one through. So let's, whenever the next election is going to be, and you can see what chances we both are, because neither of us are quite sure of what the date is. So we're talking about principles. We're not. I mean, so connected, and we see the actualities here. But let's say next election, and it's basically going to be a Conservative or a Labour government.
Or Labour could well be Lib Lab, actually.
Sorry?
It's unlikely Labour will get an outright majority. It's more likely it would be in cooperation with Lib Dems, I think.
Okay, so I mean, one way or another, it's going to be a first past the post, possibly coalition government, and let's imagine that in Scotland that there is a mandate for independence. Okay, so you're going to have a Scotland that believes it has a mandate for independence, or you may have a mandate for independence, working with either a left-wing or a right-wing British government. That Scotland is then going to need to say to that government look, we can either do this like ladies and gentlemen, or we can make asses of ourselves on the international stage. And because you are the dominant party, you are not going to look good coming out of this on the international stage. If we are going to do it like ladies and gentlemen, we can create a situation that is as seamless between Scotland and England as is the case between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Because when you are in Ireland, you don't know or you hardly know. I mean, the only reason you know is that the letterboxes in Northern Ireland are painted red and they're painted green in Southern Ireland. It's tiny things like that signify the difference. So, we can keep our sense of Britishness. We are after all, we are one island of Great Britain. We can keep our sense of Britishness in the same way as the Scandinavians have their sense of Scandinavianness, even more strongly than that, I would suggest. We can keep all of that. But just as within the EU, different states are part of a union in which they still have their own individual sovereignty to the point where they can choose to leave if they want.
Right.
So we have this here. Now, the problem just now with the British Union is that unlike the European Union, Scotland is not able to choose just to leave without permission from England. In the EU, there was no problem. There was no compulsion. The EU did not compel the UK to stay in. That is what makes it a potentially colonizing dynamic. And my sense would be that, particularly if a Labour government gets elected in the next election, it's a question, and if the SNP win their mandate, or the SNP coalition wins its mandate, it's then a question of going to them and say, look, you don't want to be colonizers. You always stood for decolonization elsewhere in the world. Let's work this out in a way that particularly respects people's needs for identity. So, if you are born in Northern Ireland, I have a relative who was born in Northern Ireland because his father was senior in the British military in Northern Ireland at the time.
Right.
And he has taken out an Irish passport. The son has taken out an Irish passport because he's entitled to that, having been born there. That's the kind of creative thinking we can do that gives a win-win situation.
But I'm still, I'm with you and all of that, but I'm not sure it's going to play out that way because I can see how it could go really well, and if you had an enlightened government, the rest of the UK and in Scotland, we could be brothers and sisters and have our own independent countries and deal with the climate crisis and
exactly.
But what I see coming a bit more sadly and realistically is you have a general election with a lot of clamor because you've got a desperation to beat the Conservatives in the rest of the UK, which leads Labour not to contest Lib Dem strongholds and vice versa, which means that Labour and Lib Dems together get a majority in one scenario. And when that happens, they'll also have to have a position on Scotland, a very hardline position, because otherwise they'll risk losing seats that are marginal to Conservatives. They will have to have under no circumstances does Scotland become independent. Now,
well, remember that Labour's only got one MP just now, is it?
Yeah, but again,
one MP. That's the mandate of Labour in Scotland.
Yeah, I totally get the unfairness and the ludicrousness of it, but I'm also speaking about the realpolitik of how things function and how people see it in the rest of the UK. They may just not recognize the result, especially if it's quite close. They might say it's not legitimate because people didn't want to vote for one issue; they wanted to vote for other issues. Or
I'm sure they will say that.
Whatever.
It's not might. I mean, that's so part of the game plan.
This is where coming back to Stephen Noon's point, you can really envisage this, and then what you have is maybe you do have a majority for independence, but probably it doesn't legally create the constitutional shift. There's no white paper on independence at this point, I don't think.
No.
And moreover, people haven't voted for it as such. What might happen now is you suddenly say, okay, you've done enough, we'll give you a referendum, right? That's a scenario I could imagine happening. But then with a new Lib Lab government and progressive hope brought back to the UK as a whole, people weary of the referendum in Scotland. Suddenly it's not so clear who's going to win in Scotland. So
no, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. You know, if England votes in a way that no longer pushes things down a Tory line, that is going to weaken the case for Scottish independence. That's a fair point. That's, you know, at the same time, we're wary. I mean, we had the Tony Blair years that started off great.
And then Iraq.
I mean, at the beginning of the Tony Blair years, people like myself, or Kenyon Wright, the constitutionalist, the Canon Kenyon Wright, who I worked very closely with from the People in Parliament project in 1988 to 1989, in the 1998 to 99, in the run-up to the referendum. People like Kenyon and I were not in favour. We're not in favour of Scottish independence because we.
Sorry, just to say, I think it was a bit earlier. Right? Wasn't it 90?
But you know, even with Tony Blair, you know, after a honeymoon period, that went corrupt with the Iraq War and all the rest of it, and all the hubris that followed. And then we've had the kind of Tory scene that's followed on with Boris Johnson now and Liz Truss coming in. And it's kind of like at a very deep level, Jonathan, I think, you know, a lot of thoughtful people in Scotland are saying, hang on, wait a minute, you know, there are cultural differences here. There are cultural differences here that express politically over decadal eras. And it's time for us to move into a situation where in Scotland, the people are suffering.
I mean, it could well happen. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't quite see it as cultural differences. I see a broken politics. I see a sort of exhausted and corrupt political class. But I'm still thinking of my mates in York and Newcastle and Manchester, whoever, who are almost exactly the same boat.
They're in the same boat, but it is a different culture still. You know, in Scotland, my friend Richard Roberts, professor of religion and theology, puts it in Gellner's terms, that in Scotland you have a high-low culture, as he calls it. Now, that is a very interesting thing. It's basically saying you've got a classical popular culture. The pibroch, the bagpipe music, the classical bagpipe music, and indeed its reflection in our poetry, is a popular classical dynamic. And that is a very interesting dynamic, of which I do not see. I mean, I wish I could see an equivalent in England. When I speak and write about England, I do my best to find you know, popular English stuff. John Clare, Mary Webb, Gerard Winstanley. I mean, all of these I've been writing about just in the past week. I draw on these. Blake, of course, but there are relatively few. And I see this as part of the oppressiveness that the social class system has laid in England. Let me tell you that when I was asked at the Malvern Festival to speak alongside David Owen on the theme of, you know, his theme was hubris. The theme of the conference was crisis about 4 years ago. I did an interesting experiment that I showed on screen. I Googled the Highland clearances to get images from fine art. And there are many fine art images depicting the social history of the Highland clearances. And I Googled the Irish famine. And again, you've got a lot of images, although actually only, surprisingly, because Ireland was still under colonization then, you have only one fine art image depicting the Irish famine by a Cork-based artist called MacDonald. And I Googled the English enclosures. And do you know, Jonathan, I have found not one, and nobody I've consulted, I broadcasted far and wide on Twitter saying, does anybody know of a fine art image depicting the English enclosures. Right. And the only one that you get is an image of English enclosures, people being evicted from the village by an Irish artist. And this shows the extent to which the powers that be in England have censored out England's social history, as E.P. Thompson, in his Making of the English Working Classes, fully recognized. But, how much has E.P. Thompson taught in the history curriculum of English schools just now? He's not. You speak to English history school teachers and they despair at what they're not allowed to teach. It's like the former Soviet Union almost. It's horrific. It's horrific. I mean, one teacher, a senior teacher in an English school in Leeds, he said to me, we're allowed to teach about the empire and about royalty and the glorious revolution, and that's about it. They're not allowed to teach the downside. I'm sure that must be changed. I said to him, surely that's changing around the edges. And he said, it's not allowed to because we're so tightly inspected. Right. And you'll get parents reporting on us if we do this.
Right. Well, I think, that like the polls are still that most people think, and I think this is UK wide, although I'm sure it's different in Scotland, but maybe not that much different, that still think broadly that the British Empire was a good thing.
Yeah, but in Scotland it's very different. I mean, in Scotland, I think you will find very few people who would still argue that the British Empire was a good thing, except British Scots like Nigel Biggar, the scholar Professor Nigel Biggar, professor of moral theology at Oxford, I think he is, whose big thing is the benefits of the empire. And Nigel is he also argues in favor of torture. He considers torture is justified in a just war situation. He wrote a book that I reviewed on just war theory because he pushes just war as distinct from non-violence. Right. So you will get Scots like that, but across Scottish culture as a whole, I think you'd be quite hard pushed these days to find many supporters of the empire.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's an empirical question, I guess. But anyway, it's a lot of interesting material, and we've kicked the ball around quite a bit. Yeah, I don't know. I suppose last thing for me to say is just, I'm in touch with all my family in Scotland.
Let me turn this whole thing around, because I always say to people, the best test of how well you understand your position is how well you can put the other side's position.
Yeah.
So let me have you ask me, what would be the case against Scottish independence? And I would say, if I may, the case against Scottish independence is Great Britain is one geographical entity. It is one island that has had a lot of common history to it. We're deeply intermarried and so on. Yes, we have political differences, but there are cultural differences that go deeper than that. And if we start running separate political dynamics where, for example, one side might be left-wing and one side might be right-wing, that is going to put us into unnecessary contestation with one another. Furthermore, Great Britain is a powerful entity in the world. It's got 4 nuclear submarines that patrol the oceans. That keeps us with a place at the UN Security Council. And I'm laying aside my Quaker pacifism here. We have got punch. We have got clout. We can exercise both soft and hard power in the world. And rather uniquely, because of our Protestant heritage, we have got a very deep taproot into the psyche of political power in America. We have got a special relationship with America, which is where the real power lies in the world. And therefore, it is going to be economically and politically in our interests to remain in that settlement, compared with a Europe where the EU is a thin veneer over previously constantly fighting, contesting states that can't even speak the same language to each other. They have to use English. And have I done enough?
Pretty good, pretty good. Quite credible.
You see the kind. You see the kind of point.
I mean, it's more. You could add more than that as well. Like one of the biggest ones I feel now is after Brexit, the case for independence becomes more complicated because,
of course,
you know, the British single market and the European single market don't chime very well together.
Yeah. Well, this is where what's happening in Northern Ireland is of great interest and importance. Yeah. And you know, the point I made earlier to you that in effect, if you're Northern Irish, in fact, even if you're British, I mean, look at somebody like Paul Kingsnose. I mean, Paul Kingsnose was pro-Brexit, right. And yet he's gone and settled in Ireland because it gives him a quality of life that he couldn't find. He tried to find in England, but didn't manage to find it. So he's settled in the west of Ireland somewhere.
And now Romanian Orthodox Church as well.
And now he's joined the Romanian Orthodox Church, which is, you know, that opens to another interesting area, Jonathan, which is the number of people I am seeing, people like us, who are actually quietly turning to Christianity and discovering things they never knew were there.
Yeah. Oh, I'm right.
And I can think of several.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Paul being one who's gone public about it, but I can think of others, political commentator type people, right, who've actually quietly turned to reconsidering Christianity, which they would never have done previously.
Yeah. No,
life circumstances have opened them into that.
Yeah. Well, that is another. I mean, that's a great conversation to have, but that might be another one.
That's another question. But you see, it does take us into Ernest Renan's question: "What is the nation?" in his famous 1892 lecture in the Sorbonne, that classic lecture on nationhood, where he says, "A nation is a soul, a spiritual principle." And I think what I'm trying to suggest to you tonight, that in Scotland, there is a strong sense of nation as community writ large. Mm-hmm. And that is being expressive of the soul of what it means to be a people. Right. That it is a spiritual principle, but with the proviso in Scotland, and this is where Scotland's nationalism, its orientation towards nation, is very different from right-wing types of nationalism. The proviso is that it is the preferential option for the poor, as liberation theology puts it. In Scotland, you've got a very strong sense of social justice, as distinct from individualism, and with it, a strong sense of democracy, expressed in that democratic intellectual principle. I've got various books on it on that shelf over there, which is basically saying that, yes, education creates elites, but the duty of an educated elite is to serve the demos, to serve the community. You use your education to serve the community back. You do not use it for individual gain. Yeah. That's deep, deep, deep in our culture. Right. And deeply spiritual. Mm. And I would just love to see that shared more into England. But in a way, they have to find it there themselves.
I agree. I was going to say, because if a nation is a soul, the nation is a soul, and I agree that it's easier to discern Scotland's soul.
Yeah.
England as such, not the rest of the UK, but England as such, you feel it does have a soul, but it's not really allowed to speak.
It's not allowed to express it.
Yeah.
It doesn't know itself.
Yeah.
I really think it does. And I think this is why the far right got such a grip on England. It's why UKIP got such a right, because what UKIP did was it affirmed people's right to be English. Unfortunately, and in marked contrast with what happened in Scotland, it did it in a way that refuted multiculturalism.
Right.
That was about a white England. Whereas in Scotland, we have been very strong. One Scotland, many cultures.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we are very strong in that because we realize the dangers. We see the dangers, and we know that shadow is potentially there in us. And that the only way we're going to overcome that shadow that could turn to racism, including anti-English racism in Scotland, the only way we're going to overcome it is by grounding ourselves in a deeper sense of calling that is predicated on love. Community, at the end of the day, is the dynamics of love made political.
Right. Well, that's hopefully a universal message, even if it stems, even if it sits well in Scotland. I think we're all talked out, but I'm grateful for your time and company as well.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. This was an unexpected. It was just totally off the cuff.
Yeah.
This evening, we just happened to recognize we're both on Twitter at the same time, and this.
So much better to actually talk.
Together.
Even better in person.
And we these are things, as we know, with no easy answers. And I think with Ukraine and Russia, the dynamic there is that you do have colonizing violence. In the UK, I think we could be talking about a dynamic of colonization if Scotland continues to be thwarted after a vote. But we are not talking about a violent dynamic in it. And as a Quaker and a committed pacifist, my concern is to nip any of that in the. Yeah. But we're not going. I say to people who kind of mutter in violent terms, we will not get anywhere. If what do the Beatles say? But if you go singing about Chairman Mao, you can count me out, or something like that. The lyric.
Yeah, I know the one you mean. Yeah.
You know the one I mean.
It's coming to my mind, but I don't know it very well.
Basically, any violence would poison the revolution. Yeah. And indeed, one of the concerns in Scotland is that violence could be implanted here in order to poison it. And right. that is something that there is an awareness of amongst thoughtful people.
False flag operation, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Well, listen.
Blessed be.
Good evening, blessed be indeed. Until next time.
Yeah. Go care. Well, man.
I will do. You too. Good to see you. Take care. Bye.
Good night. Good night.